Okay, now that we're recording, we're going to jump into introductions and purpose of the workshop. Again, I have everyone, all the attendees are muted. The panelists are control their own mute. And if you have questions, I'll be looking for a raised hand and then we can stop and take questions. So go ahead and raise your hand with the raise your hand button if you have a question. And then at the next appropriate time, I will stop myself or the panelists and we get to those questions. So go ahead and hit that button when that question comes up. And if it gets answered, then you can unclick it and then you'll lower your hand. So the purpose of this workshop is to improve the integration of the RSAR process into the GRC general rate casing process and into the risk spending accountability reports. One of the secondary goals is to standardize the organization format of the ramp in that process to facilitate review and to increase accountability. This workshop is mandated by Rulemaking 20-07-013, and we're working on track 4 of that requirement. So in order to give a quick update on how we've got here, there's been some feedback that the public often doesn't have a good understanding of the risk evaluation process. And so we want to highlight that in order to make sure that everyone understands where we're coming from. And that there also is a parallel track 3, which is a little further along than we are here. And the reviews to date suggest that the GRC cycle may be more effective if you look, or the RSAR process may be more effective if you look at over multiple years rather than just a 1 year. And we are pushing for standardizing some units on the RSAR to facilitate review there. So again, the track 4 SMUJU track has these questions as required in the rulemaking. These are simply, should the commission review the SMUJU voluntary agreement included in D19-04-020 and consider refinements? Then should the commission formally adopt the SMUJU voluntary agreement? And finally, should the commission adopt RAMP, RSAR, or other requirements for SMUJUs, including RSAR requirements for SMUJU GRC applications resolved through settlement agreements? If the commission adopts RSAR or other new requirements for SMUJUs, what elements should be included? So hopefully when this whole process is done, we will end up with a decision that answers all these questions or any others that might come up related to these issues. So in order to kick off this process, we're going to have Southwest Gas and Bear Valley show us what they've done for the RDF, and we're going to go back and discuss those questions again. Valerie, I have your slides all connected here. So what I'm going to do is ask you to come to the front here and start your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Jordan, if we can also unmute Brad Anderson, he will be the primary person giving the presentation. We will be doing it jointly, but he's kicking us off.
Totally. All right, there's Brad. He's going to get promoted. And he is unmuted.
Thank you. So just to clarify, Jordan, we can toggle, there's just a couple of slides I'll be speaking to, but it should be okay, right? I could just unmute myself when it's my time.
Yep, that's how it should work, yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, Brad, ready to go?
I'd like to thank everybody for participating on the call this afternoon. I'd like to thank for the commission, specifically the division or the energy division, for hosting this and allowing us to kind of go over what we did at Southwest Gas from a risk-based decision framework. My name is Brett Anderson.
Hey, Brad. This is Kevin from the Energy Division. I'd like if you could possibly speak into a microphone a little bit closer. Valerie, you too. You guys are a little soft.
I am literally sitting on top of my lap, so I don't know. I'll speak louder. Is that better?
It's a little better.
A little bit better. Okay. Give me 1 second for technical. Get to the microphone setups to see if we do anything. All right. Well, I'll speak really loud, and hopefully this works for everybody. But my name is Brad Anderson. I'm the Director of Risk Management here at Southwest Gas. And want to thank everybody for participating on the call today, and specifically the Energy Division for allowing us, Southwest Gas, to kind of go over what we did from a risk-based decision-making process. I've been with the company for about 10 years. I started off in the internal audit group. My background is accounting, a former Big Four auditor, and then transitioned over into the risk management group about 7 years ago, where I oversee our insurance program, workers' comp, business continuity, infrastructure security, and enterprise risk management. And then I'll turn it over to Val for a few minutes to kind of give herself a little brief introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Valerie Ortega. I am the regulatory manager for Southwest Gas, and I handle our California service territories. So thank you for inviting us to present. We appreciate it, and I'll turn it back over to Brad.
All right, if you could, the agenda is going to be pretty brief. We're just going to do a real high overview of our approach to this risk-based decision-making process. We'll do a brief introduction to the company, to Southwest Gas, who we are, what we do, and what type of business. We'll talk a little bit about the voluntary agreement. We'll also discuss some lessons learned from our original rate case. Then we'll talk a little bit about the risk spend accountability reporting, and then recommendations from Southwest Gas perspective. All right, please advance the next one. So Southwest Gas, who are we? I'd like to start by giving you a brief background about Southwest Gas. We are primarily a distribution gas company with a small piece of transmission. Our transmission is primarily in the northern part of the state of Nevada, and just under 800 miles of transmission. And then we also have some LNG storage, both in northern Nevada and in southern Arizona. Southwest Gas operates in 3 states, as shown on the screen: Nevada, Arizona, and California, with approximately 2.1 million customers company-wide. If you look at that company breakdown, we have about 1.1 million customers in Arizona, just under 800,000 customers in Nevada, and about 200,000 customers in California. So we're trying to connect my camera, but it doesn't want to work either. So we're just a hot mess over here. With our 200,000 customers in California, we have a fairly small footprint. That's why we're part of the small multi-jurisdictional utilities. Our geographical territory can basically be broken down into 2 jurisdictions. You look at the Northern California piece, which is basically Truckee, along with Tahoe region. And then you have the Southern California high desert area, which is Victorville, Barstow, Big Bear, and then Needles. Go ahead to the next slide. So I want to give you a little bit of a background on what Southwest Gas used to build our risk-based decision-making process. Southwest Gas, we have a relatively mature ERM program, which is Enterprise Risk Management. And we really leveraged off that program to help us build our risk assessment for the California rate case. Southwest Gas follows the COSO framework, which aligned very nicely to the Commission's CICLA 10-step risk management process, as well as the 10 general principles outlined in the voluntary agreement. ERM's overarching purpose is to assist the organization to improve decision-making and governance, also in strategy, objective setting, and day-to-day operations. So in essence, what ERM really is there to do is to better understand the company's risks, see how those risks are going to impede us from being able to meet our organizational strategic objectives and business objectives, and then adequately identify ways in which to mitigate those risks or align those risks to ensure success. So when we looked at that, we really kind of felt that this really aligns itself with what the general rate cases are trying to do, which is understand the risks that the utilities are experiencing, and then ensure that we have proper controls in place to mitigate those risks and to be able to operate our distribution systems in a safe, reliable manner. We began with our ERM risk register and focused on all the operational risks that appeared there. And then when we looked at how those operational risks were specifically applicable to California, we began to really dissect them and really break them out, because from an ERM perspective, the risks were very broad. So what we wanted to do from an operational is break those broad strategic risks to very specific operational risks. So you could have had, for example, one strategic ERM risk that was broken down into 5 or 6 operational risks, depending on what was specific to the state of California and the risks and exposures that we were facing there. Once we got comfortable with that, we secured the assistance from a third-party vendor that kind of helped us make sure that we were adhering to the voluntary agreement, and to kind of give us some extra an extra set of eyes on kind of guiding ourselves through this new uncharted waters for us. Key to this was having knowledgeable people. You know, one of the key things was having knowledgeable people in the room to answer the questions that were existing and emerging risks that were facing the California operations. As we were doing that risk assessment, having that knowledge and that base of people really helped us define those risks that were specific to the state of California. This exercise produced a good risk register that allowed us to work from. Each risk was then assessed utilizing a bow tie analysis. The bow tie approach, basically, as many of you know, has you look at the causes of the risk on one side of the equation, and then the consequences on the other side. And this will ultimately help you get a better understanding of the overarching risk. We then scored the risk and documented existing controls and any proposed mitigation plans that we believed could reduce the company's exposure to the risk. This process was the foundation for a risk-based decision-making process. And once this was completed, we confirmed each of the 10 general principles in a voluntary agreement were properly addressed. Go ahead, next slide. And Val's going to cover this one for us.
So as Brad mentioned, so we, in terms of our rate case, we had we filed our rate case under the voluntary agreement, which was a collaborative effort, I think, as we all know, between the small multi-jurisdictional utilities and the Commission Safety and Enforcement Division. So we filed our test year 2021 general rate case in August of 2019. And I believe we were the first to file under the voluntary agreement. And since then, I believe a second one of us has now filed. So two of the 4 SMJUs have now filed under the voluntary agreement. And I think that was it. I did want to, mention that Brad was humble, but he was our witness in our rate case for our risk-based decision-making process in our rate case. So, I wanted to mention that. And then also, I think Brad mentioned that we had transmission up in Northern California. It's actually limited amounts in Southern California, less than, I believe, 1,000 feet. And it's really extensions of, existing pipe. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. And that's back over to Brad now.
We'll go ahead and progress on to the next slide, which is talk a little bit about the voluntary agreement. So for those that have already filed and those that are in the preparing to file, we're all pretty familiar with the general principles. There's 10 general principles that kind of guide us through this risk-based decision-making process. And I just kind of wanted on this first one to kind of highlight on a couple and then identify these first 5 principles is where we really found value in procuring that third-party vendor to come in and assist us through that, risk identification process, fine-tuning those risks, scoring the risks, and so forth. So the first one is, the most important part, and really can't be very successful unless you identify those top risks and really understanding what are the biggest risks that are facing your company as a whole, and ensuring that you mitigate those risks, you're really going to have a safe and reliable infrastructure to kind of build upon. So what we did is we utilized that 7x7 matrix that was allowed by the voluntary agreement. The likelihood was applied on a continuous scale of that 1 to 7. That's really your probability. And then the consequences was determined by scoring 3 impact categories of safety, operations, and financial. And what we really want to do is not give those 3 key operational areas equal weight. So we used a pairwise comparison to determine of those 3, what's most important to us. And based upon that exercise, we really determined that, safety was at the forefront. So when we were looking at that consequence or the impact of a risk, safety carried a weight of about 60%, followed by operational risks, which were 25%, and then lastly, that financial aspect of a risk at 15%. We then used a scale from 1 to 7, with 1 being negligible and 7 being catastrophic for the impact of each category. The third-party vendor then took the information from the 7x7 to generate a score for that risk. Understanding how your risk score and identifying your top risk was, like I said, paramount to this whole exercise. The next key principle that I thought was really beneficial in utilizing that assistance of that third-party vendor was general principle number 5, which is present an estimate of risk mitigated to cost ratio or related risk reduction per dollar spent. This really helps you to understand the value of the proposed mitigation plan based on the cost. So as we look at that, we could really understand what kind of bang for our buck are we getting? Are we getting the amount of reduction from that mitigation plan that we anticipated? Or are we getting a nominal shift in our risk score? And maybe we need to look at other areas or other ways in which we can mitigate that risk. All right, so if we advance to the next one, we're right here on the next top 10, or the 6 through 10. This one, in my perspective, is kind of unique to the organization, meaning we didn't really feel like we got a lot of value from the third party on this, was because this is just kind of painting that picture of who you are as a company and what's important and the lessons learned. You look at that principle 6, identify lessons learned to apply in future filings. That's going to be unique for all of us. We're all going to have different things that we're going to experience. We're going to have different interpretations that we might interpret based on the voluntary application, or the voluntary agreement, I apologize. And it's going to be very unique to us. Principle number 7, which is moving toward a probabilistic calculation, on paper, that's a really good idea. And I'm very supportive of that. But in reality, that could be very challenging. And what I mean by that is there's certain types of risk that has numerous amounts of data that you can really dig into that quantifiable information and kind of analyze it and get that data out, that you could build a really good, strong probabilistic model for that risk. But then there's other types of risks that are a little bit softer, right? They're a little bit more hypothetical. and you're really kind of taking that higher end qualitative approach where you're just taking that common knowledge, that really good base understanding, and trying to basically quantify it by using qualifying metrics. So this is one of those areas that I think it could be explored a little bit better. I think this is an area where the utilities and the commission can work together to kind of outline and define what does this really look like, and how can we implement this to improve this risk-based decision-making process. The next one that I want to kind of touch on is item number 9, which is describe the company's safety culture, executive engagement, and company's compensation policies. Again, this one that I think is unique because each company's safety culture is different, right? However, I would argue the one similarity is that we all have strong safety culture. They may look different, but at the end of the day, the overarching intent and purpose of it is to be safe, to have a reliable distribution system, and ensure that we're not bringing harm upon those that we serve. You know, this is highlighted in Southwest Gas's safety mission, which states, as Southwest Gas, safety is our #1 priority at Southwest Gas. Southwest Gas will continually foster a culture where employees are empowered to embrace personal responsibility for the safety of themselves, their colleagues, and their communities they serve. And one of the programs that I feel like this highlights best is at Southwest Gas, we have a Stop Work program, where any employee at Southwest Gas has the ability and the power to stop work if they see an unsafe practice being done. And it gives them that authority to continue to stop that work until that safety issue or that safety concern is remedied. All right, so we will go on, if we could go to the next slide, which is our lessons learned. So for me, I think the biggest lesson learned was the voluntary agreement worked. I mean, it's that simple. Were there some interpretation issues? Absolutely. But I think that would have happened regardless. But at the end of the day, I really think that the voluntary agreement worked for Southwest Gas. The other lesson learned was making sure that you have ample timing. Make sure that you are planning out your process and your approach to your rate case to ensure that you've got ample time to really dive into your risk assessment, to really dive into the data that you're pulling and you're mining, and giving you that opportunity to go through and understand what that data is trying to tell you, what risks are being highlighted and are kind of glaring at you off of that page. And then the last piece of the lesson learned is make sure that you have the appropriate team in the room. And what I mean by that is make sure that those that are attending your sessions and you're kind of going through this, the risk assessment, the scoring, the mitigation approaches to the risk that you've identified, have people that have the ability to make the decisions for the company. So that way you're not have to go back and re-explain things over and over as you kind of work up through the food chain. If you could do that, you're going to be able to streamline the process quite significantly. Go ahead to the next slide, please.
So I wanted to touch on, I know that's one of the things that we're going to discuss today, and you guys, the Energy Division, are going to review, but I wanted to also touch on, the risk span accountability reporting. So up to this point, Southwest Gas has submitted Inform our RSARs, and we collaborated closely with the Energy Division to develop, our report format. And I really feel like the collaboration worked well. The Energy Division is always very helpful. With the approval of our test year 2021 GRC earlier this year, we're now going to submit our first formal report in June of next year. The point I want to make is, we, as I mentioned, we appreciate our collaboration with the Energy Division, and I believe that, this process would work well for the collective SMJU to develop a report format for formal reporting, a format that essentially would take into consideration issues that may be unique to the smaller utilities, recognizing the fact that, we are different, we're multi-jurisdictional, and there, as mentioned, there are issues that are unique to us. And, I think that if we, just foster that collaborative effort, I think that may continue to work well for us. And we would certainly be open to doing that. Next slide, please.
So it boils down to recommendations. So if we had our way, which we know we don't, these are some of the things that we would recommend or we propose we continue to do. So we would recommend that we continue to utilize that voluntary agreement for all SMJUs. As Valerie pointed out earlier, I think we're about half submitted utilizing the voluntary agreement, and then we still have some that haven't. So I think it would be really beneficial to have all SMJUs submit their filing utilizing that voluntary agreement. And then let's go, and after they've all submitted, then let's go in and review and discuss what are some areas of improvements? What are those areas that we all kind of had a similar misunderstanding of what the ask was? What were maybe some discrepancies between what the voluntary agreement was asking for versus the testimony templates? And then the last part is, as Valerie kind of pointed out, we really enjoy kind of the collaboration that's occurred up to this point with regards to the SMJUs and the filing process. And we would encourage that we continue that collaboration with the Energy Division on the RSARs. And with that kind of concludes what we have prepared for the presentation. So we'll go ahead and open it up for any questions that the group.
If you raise your hand, I can pick on you and get your question answered. I can also see it in the chat. But Brad, I have a question for you to start this off. When you went through the process of quantifying that risk, was there anything that showed up at the end of the process that you didn't think was going to be there in the beginning, or change in order, or what was your biggest surprise after doing all that work?
There were some on there that you just knew were going to come up, like
Right.
the COIL program. That was one that if that didn't get on there and didn't rank high, I would have been shocked. The one that got on there that I was, it's an appropriate risk and it definitely has its space on there, but I was shocked that it came in where it did, was the snow sheds or meter sets in the Lake Tahoe Truckee area, that high snow load where they could get a snow load of 6 feet of snow overnight. That was one, as we really kind of dug in and looked at the historical information and the programs that we've tried in the past. That's one that really came in and says, hey, really the best program or the best utilization of funds or sources is if we could go in and kind of create a structure to protect the facilities from getting damaged due to that excessive weight of the snow in those high mountain areas.
Interesting. Okay. Now, is there any difference in the risks that you see in California, or is there a challenge you see in start separating the risk across jurisdictions?
I think one of the biggest challenges is just the footprint. When you look at, like you look at our two largest service territories, which would be the Las Vegas Valley metropolitan area, and then you look at Central Arizona. There's just some different challenges in operating in those highly dense populated areas as opposed to operations in kind of Victorville, which is a little bit of a smaller community, or Barstow, or up in Big Bear. And then you really get into kind of some interesting, unique things when you get up into that Northern California, Tahoe, Truckee area. Specifically, one of the things that's different from our other service territories is that shortened window of being able to go in and do work in those areas, because they'll shut down the permitting and the licensing due to, winter's coming, and they don't want people up there, digging stuff up and having some rogue storm come in and then shut down, and now you're not prepared to close down the job site like you were. So there's just kind of those uniqueness. Those are some of those unique things that you got to take into account and to differentiate between the different service territories.
Is any of that driven by the different regulatory requirements across the jurisdictions?
That I will have to punt over to Val. She's more familiar with the regulatory side. I'm more familiar with the insurance and the risk side.
Right.
Jordan, are you asking more like on the pipeline safety side, or, with respect to that, or what specifically in terms of the differences between the jurisdictions?
Yes, and I was really gearing towards, does California, or working across the jurisdiction with having to deal with California, causing any issues in your risk management or risk calculations because of the different requirements?
Well, no, I would say, the risk-informed process is unique to California. As Brad mentioned earlier, we have the ERM that we utilize company-wide, but specific. It wasn't very difficult. We did have to access, a third-party consultant to assist in the process, since that piece was new to us. But, they assisted us well, and, that's where I think the, in terms of applying the principles for the voluntary agreement, and then, quite frankly, to give kudos also to Bear Valley, because they were first to, and I forgot to mention, and I know you're aware that, the voluntary agreement was based on Bear Valley showing in their rate case, and then Pacific Core's testimony. So, yeah, I think, from that aspect, I don't think it was too difficult, unless, Brad, you think it was. And but no, I think it's unique to California, but we do have, the ERM across, all of our 3 states.
Great. Okay, we finally got a question here from Chris Parks. I'm going to see if I can unmute him. Chris, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Yeah, I appreciate. I had a couple different questions. One had to do with what I think you were touching upon, Jordan, which is, do you see that being that you do operate under different jurisdictions, that somehow, well, how do you have anything to say about how that may tie into your doing this voluntary agreement for California? Does the California risk management process change what you're doing, or what you're doing under other jurisdictions change how you're addressing California? I'm just curious if you have any kind of summary for that.
That's a great question. Let me I'll give a little bit more color on the difference between our ERM program and then what we've done accommodate under the voluntary agreement to incorporate that information into our general rate case. So our ERM program, one of those key things from our ERM program is that we're really focusing in on strategic risks. So they're those broader, bigger scoped risks that are going to keep Southwest Gas from meeting strategic objectives, business objectives, shareholder objectives, it's kind of those broad management I mean, when I say management, I mean senior leadership metrics that they're concerned about and how they want to drive the direction of the organization. So one of the challenges was to kind of take a look at those risks, really understand of those risks, which ones have an operational undertone to them, and then taking those and dissecting them out even further of those risks that are operational in nature, how do they fall out, and how do those risks particularly, specifically look at in California? And I'll give you an example, and this wasn't, I don't believe this was a risk that we had on there, but just kind of so we could kind of see what I'm talking about, is one of our ERM risks is a catastrophic explosion, right? So when we were looking at that from a operations perspective, what are the things that could drive a catastrophic explosion that results in loss of life? Well, you could have third-party dig-ins, you could have mismarks, you could have your own contractor could be digging and hitting pipe, and so forth. So taking a look and understanding how those are unique in each of your jurisdictions was a little bit of a challenge, because what's driving third-party dig-ins, let's say in Arizona, may not be what's driving those third-party dig-ins in California. So one of the things that was a bit of a challenge, but at the same time kind of fun, was really working closely with our California operations group and understanding what the risk looked like and what was driving that risk for their specific locations. And that's something that we typically don't get into that deep of detail from an ERM perspective. So it is very unique for California and unique for this, specifically for this rate case, but at the same time, wasn't overburdensome. And I think it was a good exercise to kind of really get us comfortable with those things that we were recommending in our rate case. Hopefully that answers your question.
Well, that was a very positive answer, Brad. I appreciate hearing that. Could you add a little bit more detail before Chris goes on to his second question about what that driver was, just for my own edification?
And that's probably why I didn't answer that second part of the question. What driver in particular?
Oh, you said there was the drivers between California risk of explosion versus Arizona was significantly different. What was the driver on that?
Oh, that was just a hypothetical example.
Oh, okay.
You know, and it could be different things. Like you've got a larger contracting group in Arizona, let's say, that's out there that's, you know, working around our lines versus say up in Tahoe. So where when you have those meetings with those contracting, those excavation groups, they really get it. They really understand the danger and the exposure. So it could potentially reduce that possibility of them hitting our lines, where you've got probably 100 pool companies in Arizona, along with, you know, 1,000 landscaping companies, you know, so that group, that population of people that you have to reach out and talk with is much more expansive in those broader, bigger rural or urban areas than in the suburban areas.
Right. Okay. No, I get that. Chris said he had one more question. I'm trying to unmute him, see if he wanted to get that second question
I'm
done.
unmuted now. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. So I guess I would just mention or ask, try to squeeze in two questions if there's time. But one is, I mean, this slide mentions, you know, continue the voluntary agreement. And so one question I'm asking is there any downside to Southwest Gas adopting a framework that's more in line with the larger utilities in terms of its risk management process? And kind of aligned with that are, you mentioned earlier that you know, in your ERM process, you have your senior leadership, which is looking at broad metrics at the enterprise level. But I think what would also be useful would be to understand Southwest Gas metrics, which are used for risk management, that the commission has adopted for the larger utilities here that operate in California, and understanding how Southwest Gas risk management program performs compared to the other utilities. And that way, we could learn in California what you may have been applying, you know, outside of California in your ERM process. So wanted to ask those two questions.
I'll kind of start on the first one. I think the reason why I like the voluntary agreement is because I think it's kind of adopted in a way in which it accommodates and benefits those utilities that are operating in multiple jurisdictions. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You've got, for example, Southwest Gas that operates in Nevada, Arizona, and California. Even when you look at their operations in California, they're very minimal. We don't have a large presence. We have 200,000 customers kind of in that high desert of Southern California and up in the Sierra Nevadas of Northern California. And then you compare that to, you know, say one of the larger utilities like PG&E, where their entire footprint, I couldn't even tell you how many customers, you know, millions of customers, right, up there in Northern California for PG&E. And their entire focus is on the state of California. So when you look at their teams, their entire team is focused on that. Whereas if we were to put that amount of scrutiny and be held to that same standard that the large utilities that have that single footprint in California, I think it would put a little bit of a strain on our resources and potentially require us to do some additional hirings for positions just to manage this aspect of the rate. Because despite the similarities between what we do from an ERM perspective, there are differences. For these California rate cases, we have to really get a lot more granular in our approach, and we leverage some of the scoring mechanisms because you want them to be a little bit more concise and a little bit more specific. So we're leveraging that assistance off that third-party vendor to kind of help us kind of fine-tune those points that we're not hitting on that RM perspective. And then your last question, if I understood it correctly, was would there be value of the lessons learned from our other operating jurisdictions to those that operate in California? I think that you could do that without having the small utilities follow suit of the large utilities by having more meetings like this, where the SMJUs are meeting and discussing the risks that they're seeing outside of California and how they're approaching them, and then determining on whether or not that'd be beneficial from a greater perspective or a greater scheme from the commission's perspective. But you know, for us, I think the voluntary agreement is that right amount, that right blend of getting the information that's beneficial and not putting an overly amount, you know, a large burden upon us as a utility for footprint size that we have.
That's great, Brad. I appreciate those answers. Those are very thoughtful. I know I learned a couple things there. We're gonna move on to the Bear Valley Electric Service presentation now. So if I could get Paul to ramp up here and he'll kick off on his. We can always go back to more questions in the second half if there are any, and you can always again put them in the question box, raise your hand, and we can queue them up later. But in order to stay on schedule here, we're gonna ask Paul. Looks like Paul's ready to go.
Yep. So Paul Marconi, President, Bear Valley Electric Service Incorporated. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to try and keep it. This brief is more on process, but we can talk about specifics. We'll talk about the requirements. Just a brief overview of Bear Valley, the small multi-jurisdictional risk-based decision making, and then some refinements. Go to the next slide. So just for those who don't know, Big Bear or Bear Valley Electric's in Big Bear Lake. It's a pretty small area, 32 square miles. If you were to subtract out the lake, it's even smaller. And a little over 24,500 customers. So small system, but quite a bit of risk because of where we are. We're in the high fire threat district, tiers 2 and 3. Just a lot of vegetation and dry about 80% of the year. Go to the next slide. We get most of our power comes through the lines from Edison, buy out in the market, but we bring it up the mountain through the Edison lines. Really the key there. Go to the next. All right, so back in 2014, as this risk-based decision making was considered by the commission, there was a recognition that what are we going to do with the small utilities? The intent, at least from what we read, was, hey, the small utilities need to transition to risk-based decision-making framework, and that needs to be incorporated in their rate cases, beginning 3 years from the effective date of the decision. We actually implemented in our rate case filed in 2017, early 2017. It was basically a little early before we were required to, but we thought it made sense rather than split hairs there. And so that was voluntary. And there is recognition that, due to the size of the small energy utilities, it may not be practical or appropriate to go at the same level as the large IOUs. But still, we want to have some sort of risk-based decision-making framework and make sure that the commission gets a good understanding of what the risks are and how we're going to mitigate them throughout, and how that's reflected in our GRC revenue requirement. So if we go to the next slide. So the approach that we picked was to try and use first the same lexicon as everybody else was using in California, the large IOUs. We also wanted to have a risk management process that was, grounded in industry, and the ISOs are pretty good standards across multiple industries, and so we wanted something that was grounded in the ISO 31000, and then we wanted something that was conceptually along the lines of what other California utilities and the CPUC were discussing, recognizing that back in 2017 that was a fast-moving target. And then we worked with an expert to help us get to the point of having a program in place. Go to the next. And so the process we came up with, which is similar, to what in the voluntary agreement, was the cycle 10 process. We sort of simplified it for ourselves, combined some of the steps, but basically risk identification, analysis, evaluation, and scoring, mitigation determination, and then you've got the informed project decision making, and then finally monitoring. But it involves all the elements, the 10 steps that are in the cycle of 10. We could go to the next. So the way, as was identified in the previous brief, there was a voluntary agreement, and basically we use a 7x7 logarithmic risk matrix, frequency versus impact. The impact side, we have some weights, so the consequence isn't just one singular focus, but we broke it up into 5 areas, and they're weighted differently. Safety is obviously the highest weight. We did avoid finance at the time, and we've not brought finance into the picture. And we have thus far analyzed 18 risks or threats, and to address those, we have about 54 mitigations that are in our risk register and model. That doesn't mean we're implementing all those mitigations, but it means, whole purpose is to look at the risks, then come up with mitigations, and then evaluate which are the best mitigations. And this 7x7 model can also be viewed as kind of a heat map that you see up there in the corner. There's a lot of things that go into consideration that have an impact when you're looking at risk spend ratio, so you look at the risk reduction, and then we look at the annual cost of a program or project. Obviously, the period of the project impacts that cost, so that we can get an apples to apples comparison. And one of the challenges is if you have an O&M solution versus a capital solution, making sure you're getting an annualized cost comparison. We go to the next. So one of the, I know a lot of the large IOUs have gone to the bow tie method, which is also a very good process. And one of the benefits of the bow tie is it allows you to take several mitigations in concert with an event and see how they work together on the outcome. Generally, in this method, you're either affecting impact or frequency. It's pretty rare that you're affecting both. And so as you visualize each mitigation by itself, you sort of got to superimpose other mitigations and see how they play together. And then it becomes which one goes first? What if you're doing them together? Where do you end up on the plot? And so, for example, if you address impact first, and then you address frequency, you arrive at that point. Or is it better to address frequency first, and so forth? So that's kind of one of the challenges of this method, is you sort of have to, and with 54 mitigations and 18 risks, you can see how that can be a little, this is a simple drawing, but in reality, it's a complex problem to have in your head. Okay, let's put it that way. So you have to really spend some time with this. Go to the next. So one of the big outputs of the model is the risk reduction and then also the risk spend ratio. So obviously the risk spend ratio is the risk reduction divided by the cost. Somehow we went too far. So and so you got to look at these closely, and across what risk are you intending? So in this case, we're looking at wildfire public safety mitigations, and there's some risks there. It's obvious there. The risk-spend ratio is significant, right? And so it's a no-brainer. There are others where there's multiple things that have to be done for wildfire safety or mitigate, and one of them might be to strengthen poles or address weakened poles. So the weakened poles can be addressed by load testing them and replacing them as required. You could shift to undergrounding, which would be way more expensive. But even when you look at assessing poles and replacing them as they needed, the risk-spend ratio may be pretty low. And so you got to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. Like this one at 14.2, that's weather consulting, okay? Does nothing for pole strength, okay? So some risk-spend ratios are going to be low compared to others, but there really is no viable alternative. So you have to look at each mitigation and what it accomplishes, so that you make the right decisions in addressing the risk overall. But this chart is very helpful in sorting out multiple mitigations and the cost effectiveness of those mitigations. Go to the next one. So one of the problems that we had, and is okay, covered wire is a great wildfire risk mitigation project, has a good RSC. Well, where do we apply it? And so we built a what we call a fire safety matrix. It's basically, we took all our circuits and figured out which ones were the highest risk. And then as we implement the covered wire project on different circuits, how that risk is being reduced, so that you just don't blanket go implement the risk across all circuits, or the mitigation across all circuits, but rather you do it in a prioritized manner. And so that's how we got that granularity on applying the overall mitigation. So the overall mitigation was identified by our risk model, but how do you execute it in a manner that you get the best, most efficient results? And you may not have to implement across 100% of your circuits. You may only need to do it across 70% of your circuits to achieve the desired risk reduction. Okay. And so this is something we use to give us a little more granularity, a little more taking some of the SME judgment out of there, and being a little more quantitative. Go to the next one. So clearly this is more, we focus very much on the wildfire risk. And so we've reached out to some expert consultants, because we certainly don't have this capability in-house, to develop, and I think this is REACTS, but to develop us a risk from power line ignitions in this case, so that we could use more probabilistic methods, both on the consequence side and on the frequency side. Although I will say the consequence is very good modeling, and because it's based on the weather patterns and terrain and so forth. They have very good act and fuels understanding. On the frequency side, it's based on the ignition database here in California, which is, hasn't been in existence for a tremendously long period of time. And for example, Bear Valley has no ignitions, so we have to rely on assume that the database driven, the overall database in California is reflective of our area. But it's better than before, where we had an SME decide what that was. So I think we're moving in the right direction. This one is based on the area. So if you had an ignition, what's the risk of having a large area fire? And you can see there's some red areas on the heat map. And so those are obviously areas that you want to go and target with improvement projects to remove the risk of having an ignition, such as installing covered wire, getting rid of expulsion fuses, strengthening the poles, or maybe undergrounding, so forth. If we go to the next one, this one is similar to the previous chart. It's just quantifying, moving towards that quantification of what are the ignition, the risk from power line ignition. This is on structures. So instead of looking at, hey, if we had an ignition in this area, well, what's the risk of having an ignition in the area and the consequence towards structures? So like if you had in the red, that would mean many more structures would be impacted by that fire. And so we're moving towards being a lot more sophisticated in the trying to quantify both on the frequency side and the impact side. Go to the next. Okay, before I go to questions, I guess one thing I know in the previous brief they talked about the RSRs, and we were right. Our last rate case was approved pretty much while the RSRs were being developed, and so in our final decision, it was very specifically mandated what we needed to report. But what we've discovered since then, I think, is sort of a little trouble with. So some of the projects or some of the reports in the RSR are just purely by FERC accounting code. And then others, we call out some specific programs. And it gets a little confusing because sometimes those programs span across some of the FERC accounting codes. And so we're trying to mix and match. And then, no one would have imagined this, but after all this went down, obviously the wildfire mitigation planning process developed. And I think we're pretty stable now in that there are some very specific initiatives that the utilities, the electric utilities have to report on. And many of those initiatives are pretty standard O&M safety matters. For example, there's transformer maintenance and line maintenance and so forth. And so given that the utilities have to report on these to the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, and that process is pretty developed, I think as we move towards our next, rate case and RSR report, it might be useful to take a hard look and make sure we're sort of not creating two different reports, but rather try to get as much, because I think the wildfire mitigation plan is the safety issues that we're interested in. And so maybe we ought to be aligned with those, would be my recommendation. I'm open to questions.
And we got lots of good hands popping up here. I'm going to start though with my favorite question, which I asked Southwest Gas, which is, you've gone through a couple cycles now, Paul, and I've seen your risk score drop over the last few RSRs. Is there any surprises in what projects got prioritized there based on your ranking, or do you think it's just a quantification of what you would have expected?
I will tell you that our initial, when we were more heavily SME driven, we were not surprised because those were kind of our opinions.
Right.
I will say though that once we quantified and looked, I would have thought certain areas that have been higher risk or risk in the wildfire models.
Mhm.
But you know, when I looked at the structure model, it became apparent to me that, you know, that was a little more eye-opening of where we need to focus rather than that, because it's easy to wrap your head around the area consequence, but the structure was a little surprising to me. And so that's kind of shifted our where we focus. And so I think those models are good at targeting specific areas. Um,
So if I heard you correctly, you're saying you're now prioritizing structures higher than you did before the quantification effort.
right. Yes, for sure.
Okay. Oh, excellent. Interesting. All right. Let's go to Miles Gordon. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Miles from Cal Advocates. I just had a question. You mentioned when you were discussing the impact weights that you didn't calculate financial impacts, avoided financial impacts, I think was the word you used. And I guess I'm just curious why that is.
So when I say financial impacts, it's impacts to the company. And I think when we initially started, I think that was we were watching the other proceedings, and they weren't really addressing. There was kind of a movement not to address the financial impacts to the company. Does that make sense?
Okay, so I guess just to clarify, you are looking at like sort of catastrophic wildfire losses
Yes.
to cousin. Okay.
But we haven't put a value, like, for example, you know, wildfire that results in the death of one fatality. We haven't put a value on that.
Okay. All right, thanks.
All right, now we're going to go back to Chris Parks. Should be able to unmute yourself, Chris. There you go.
Yes, I can now. Thank you. Thank you. Paul, I had a couple of questions related to the metrics. So first question is, do you see any issue in Bear Valley reporting on the similar metrics that the larger utilities report on, related to Bear Valley? Would there be any issue in Bear Valley reporting on those same metrics? And then earlier you mentioned that you've not experienced any ignitions. And I'm assuming you're talking about any ignition, not necessarily ignitions that relate to a wildfire or larger impact. But is there something? I think a lot of the other larger utilities, they have quite a few ignitions, and so what would you attribute that to? Is it because of size, terrain, practices, standards, or is there anything that you would be able to offer in terms of why that is for Bear Valley? So,
Okay, let me address first on the ignitions. The commission has some very specific definitions of what an ignition is, and we haven't had anything that falls in that category. And I will say that, and I think we make the statement 10 years, because I've looked back at 10 years worth of records and interviewed people and so forth and couldn't find anything. There are no reports. But I can tell you, since I've been here since 2014, and the biggest thing we embarked on early on and really pushed even further and is obviously vegetation management, making sure vegetation is well clear of the lines. Honestly, in the beginning, it was more for reliability, trying to avoid outages. But that's kind of shifted now. I think the safety from having a good clearance is a sidebar is, yes, you get good reliability, but the real benefit's the safety of no ignitions. And so that's where we are on that. The metrics, I'm not quite familiar with what you're asking. I know in the large IOUs proceedings, there are some specific metrics that they've been working on, but I'll be honest with you, I'm not familiar exactly what those metrics are. I would have to look at them. But I can tell you that we report the same stuff on the wildfire mitigation quarterly reports as the other large IOUs report, and we don't seem to have trouble doing that. So I don't know that we would have trouble without looking at them. I could probably guess we wouldn't, but I would need to look at it for sure.
Thank you. But do you
you
have
asked
anything that comes to mind in terms of why you don't have ignitions compared to other larger utilities?
So we use a little bit larger clearance. So in GO 95, for our voltages, the minimum, and the key word is the minimum clearance is 48 inches is when you have to initiate trimming. We've decided that due to the risk in our area and due to trees being laden with ice and being weak, so branches can break off and stuff, we've increased that. So we trim when vegetation encroaches within 72 inches, and when our preventative maintenance, the tree trimmer will trim out to 12 feet or even further in order to prevent, when they come back around, it being within 72 inches. So the idea is you never want to have vegetation within 72 inches. We also, for our sub-transmission system, we require blue sky. So we don't allow any branches to overhang the sub-transmission system. And then we have a couple of other things like, trees that are in the drip line, we trim them the way down as well. Fast growers, we identify them and visit them more frequently and so forth. But we have a pretty aggressive vegetation management program. And fortunately, I think the locals, the customers have been very supportive of that, especially after they watched some of the stuff that's happened in the rest of the state. We don't get very many complaints, let's put it that way, as I would have thought.
That's interesting. Okay. Chris, did you have another one? Sorry, did I cut you off?
No, that's what I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hand raises, and we're at our break. We'll give you all another chance to ask any questions on the second half. Let's go ahead and start our 10-minute break. So we're back here at 2:25. All right, thank you guys. And we're gonna start off the second half of this with just an overview of where we are on this 3 topics that are defined for track 4. And we briefly touched on these in the beginning of the hour. And we're going to go over them one more time here with the idea that at the end of this, we're going to ask for some written comments or to be submitted to myself, which will then summarize. So again, the comments we're required to discuss are these 3 that we talked about at the beginning of the hour, which are: should the commission review this Voluntary Agreement and consider refinements? again, we both of the presenters talked about the voluntary agreement and reference it, and they are following it. A couple of the SMUJs have already moved beyond the basic 7x7 matrix and have done some more complex risk analysis and risk scoring. Bear Valley showed us some of their risk scoring they've adopted there and how they're implementing that. And I think what I learned from those presentations was that 7x7 matrix is a relatively solid foundation for some of these SMUJs to work off of, and it seems to not be overly burdensome. But there may be more work that we can do there to move further into a more quantified approach, as some of the larger IOUs are doing. And then the third bullet there is what a standardization of the RDF process defined by the CPUC improve accountability and risk-based decision-making framework. So with the scoring between the SMUJs that we showed, would a standardization make it easier to evaluate that? I mean, right now, every SMUJU is coming up with their own risk score, and you can't compare across SMUJUs or really even across some different years because of the way the scoring changes. But so that question is addressed in a more defined process if it was developed. And then this last bullet here, this question got brought up a couple times, is how is the complexity of operating across jurisdictions such as state lines addressed in the RSAR process? And it sounds like, at least the experience from Southwest Gas, that there wasn't seem to be too many issues as far as regulatory hurdles to do that. The refining of some of the calculations that Southwest Gas highlighted actually showed some benefit in the requirements in California. Topic B is, should the commission adopt it? Now, it's quite obvious that if we just adopt it as it's written, that some of the work that's happening in track 3 would, some of the improvements we're finding in track 3 would not be available to this RSAR process. Some of these improvements include multi-year tracking. We're finding that just the simple reporting of a one-off case can often miss issues such as continued underspending on one program or overspending on another, and not highlight the cumulative effect of those issues. And we're also trying in track 3 pushing for a focus on more consistent units. So more programs with defined units, even if the initial GRC process did not have imputed units, having some sort of metric to track process has always been beneficial. And then a tighter integration of the GRC RSAR process. I think this actually showed up in the discussion with Bear Valley, where they were using FERC projects and then some SME focus groups and trying to match those lines up when it's not in their cost accounting system. So an early adoption in the GRC process with programs and cost accounting that would drive the RSAR process may be beneficial, and trying to get that now with the current adoption of the voluntary agreement may not be entirely possible, but it could be facilitated with a more rigorous control on that. I went the wrong way. Okay. C, should the commission adopt the RAMP, RSAR, and other requirements for SMUJUs, including RSAR requirements in the SMUJU GRC application resolved through settlement agreements? If the commission adopts RSAR or the requirements for SMUJUs, what elements should be included? No comments were received that suggest the RSAR process should not apply to GRC applications resolved through settlement agreements. I would love to hear some comments on this issue in particular, just because it does end up in our track 4 issues, but I haven't heard or seen anything that would suggest that it shouldn't be adopted. Refinements to the RSAR are being developed in track 3 and may be appropriate to SMUJUs. Talked about that in the last slide. There is stakeholder interest in addressing risk in GRC rather than standalone RAMP applications for SMUJUs. And then finally, a single ramp GRC process for SPUJs would allow for administrative efficiency among SPUJs and reviewers. This was stated in the original SMAP, and I don't think no one's proposed otherwise. Again, a single ramp GRC process seems appropriate for the risk level in the SMUJs, and we don't see we need a whole separate ramp process at this point. And again, no comments were received to suggest otherwise on this to date. So what I want to do after this workshop is, if there is written comments that address these issues or other issues that we've brought up here, I would love to receive them. And the plan is to have CPUC staff summarize those comments for the group, and then identify the majority and minority views and recommendations, and then hold a technical working group to discuss issues. Or if the initial comments come in and there's enough detail there to proceed forward, to prepare a summary of those comments for review by interested parties. So basically what I'm saying, there's going to be a chance for comments now, create the summary, another chance for comments, or another technical working group, and then that will feed the final proposal where the CPU staff will prepare, or a joint proposal from the parties, and that will guide the final decision for the proceeding for the judge. All right, so having blown through that rather quickly, I wanted to see if there were any other questions regarding these statements. So I'm actually going to roll back to the topics that we're tracking and see if I can see any hands popping up. Wendy. All right, Wendy, thanks for coming up with the question. I got you unmuted. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me, Jordan?
Coming in through loud and clear.
Okay, great. I just actually thought of a question. It was on the last thing that you had put up. And it's kind of a question to the small and multi-jurisdictional utilities. If we, yeah, thank you. If we continue moving forward to not have a standalone ramp, but have it kind of as part of the GRC process, I mean, is there anyone that has thought about how that process would allow for, like, for example, Safety Policy Division to do some kind of evaluation and then get that evaluation into the GRC process? I just wonder about that out loud.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Wendy. I haven't thought about that, but I'm making a note on it now. Did you have any thoughts on how that could look, what that might look like?
I don't. So I think it's just something to kind of ask people, because I think we're also kind of thinking it through and trying to learn in the large IOUs too, because what's happening with the large IOUs is, after our evaluation reports, you know, for example, after in PG&E's rate case, they did respond to many things that we recommended and other parties. So, but there isn't really a process for the SPD to weigh in the GRC and say, okay, you know, this was responded to adequately or not, or whatever. It's more just from an advisory point of view. I mean, we are advisory, but not on the record, I guess. You know, whereas the ramp allows things to be more on the record, and the evaluation part of it to be on the record too. So it's just something to consider. I haven't even had a chance to talk to management. It's just something that, to our management, it's just something that just came to my mind.
Right, now that's a good point. Paul, I saw your hand pop up. Did you have a response to that?
I was just going to say that one solution might be, since we laid out in our last rate case, let's put it that way, our all the risks that we evaluated and then the selections we made, you know, everybody can be a party to the rate case. And we certainly got quite a few data requests on our risk-based decision making and how we came up with some of the risk scores and so forth. So, I mean, that is, if we make the risk-based decision-making framework part of the rate case, it's an open process. There's a DR process. Not that I want any more data requests, but
Right, but that's a very simple way to get SPB
yeah.
involved in it.
Right.
Right.
So that would be my suggestion.
No, I appreciate that. And like I said, Jordan and Paul, I didn't have a chance to talk to management about it. It's just something that caught my attention when you put this up here.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you for that. We got another question here from Heidi Coswell from Pacific Core. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Am I audible now?
Yep, loud and clear.
Perfect. I just wanted to say that some of the challenges that might exist have to do with basically, kind of like the understanding of the programs that are being advanced when a rate case is being put together. And I know that certainly was the experience that we had in our last one. It preceded the voluntary agreement, but like Bear Valley, we attempted to use the CYCLA process and help it inform kind of the selections. But some of the projects or the programs that were being advanced were, a portion of them were risk-based, but a portion of them were compliance-based. And to the extent that there can be more precision at that front end about setting up kind of an understanding of why something is moving forward, and then producing the data that demonstrates that it's the right thing to be spent on, and then having accountability reporting against that. I think we would set ourselves up better for that future, for that transparency and for decisions to be made.
How or what process would you perceive that would make understanding your mitigation programs better? Or what could the CPUC do to help that?
I think that it may be important for us to help kind of tease apart those programs that are compliance with no kind of risk kind of ramp association versus those that have a value around kind of the ramp piece. And I'm just trying to step back in time and think about some of the complications that occurred during that period. But when you're saying it's because it's in response to this, and compliance doesn't have to tie specifically to an operational risk in a given area, but it can in certain areas. And I think both presentations kind of spoke to that particular thing in some fashion. But if there, when you advance that program, then in a sense you're accomplishing X amount of whatever might be a risk relevant to that particular location, but there's also then the compliance requirement anyway. So it kind of, what about that is, what percentage of that is really compliance-based spend versus risk-based spend? You don't really have a way of pulling that apart, right? And so that, I think, creates some challenges for us.
Right. Okay. I think I got that written down. But can you add a little bit more on what do you think the issue is there? That
Jordan, This is Kevin. I just wanted to clarify. What it sounds like is, Heidi, what you're saying is, this is Kevin from Energy Division. It sounds like you're talking about the difference between ramp and non-ramp spending within a program, such that you have a lot of stuff that you need to spend money on that doesn't have anything to do with safety, and then you have a lot of stuff that you have to spend money on that does have to do with safety. But when you're showcasing your spending in your rate case, that money is all together. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and even the program that delivers it might be together. So for instance, let me speak to one specific that was, that I'm just pulling out of my memory bank, so hopefully this is helpful. But the increase in patrol time, or in patrols, that was a requirement of the fire safety rulemaking, so that you would have annual rural patrols conducted. Well, we did patrols previously, but they were semi-annual. And then you do more patrols, same kind of work code, if you will, but you do them then annual. So it's really about that delta that you're trying to put in there. So it becomes hard when you're going through some kind of accountability or some spending kind of explanation to try and demonstrate, okay, see, we did X number of them before this happened and Y number of them after this happened. And so here's the delta, therefore it's associated with this new spend, which was part of what was in, the rate case, and is part of, it increases safety, it reduces risk, et cetera. And so it just creates some challenges in making that, that kind of, the singularity exists between them. And so I'm not sure if I know how to solve it. I just know that it becomes hard to have that explanation in a way that makes it, that gets everybody going, okay, I got it now. And that's all I was trying to address, is that just by virtue of the way that the work may be being delivered, it may not lend itself to be pulled apart easily to be able to support the delta.
Mhm.
But I think that we're aligned with being able to demonstrate the value of those and try to figure out what the benefit in terms of risk reduction is. And and I think that Amy and Pooja will speak more, I'm sure, as necessary, but we would advocate that the voluntary approach is certainly, it seems like it kind of gets a nice middle ground for, a full-blown ramp sort of approach that may be very cost burdensome for our customers, but it gets kind of the alignment, the operational focus that's necessary to deliver risk reduction outcomes at the best possible cost.
Okay. So I think I got it, but if I could just try to go back and check my notes here, you're saying that based on there's some compliance-driven mitigations versus some risk-driven mitigations, that sussing those out between like almost a risk-benefit efficiency doesn't work, because you wouldn't necessarily have picked those, but you can always still back calculate the risk spend and show it. So I'm trying to see what the challenge or issue is there. I'm having a hard time framing it.
When the challenge ends up being in the reporting, the RSAR sort of approach, right? So it's in the accountability demonstration, and especially when subsequently somebody who was maybe not part of that process is trying to understand why we can't do, deliver me a report with all expenditures in X spending category, you have to get there kind of in a circuitous way, and that always creates confusion, I guess.
No, it does, and I think I know exactly what you're talking about now. We've seen that in a couple RSRs that have come through, even from some of the larger IOUs have a hard time doing the cost accounting on that, but it's a regulatory requirement of another cost program they already have been doing. So I totally understand what you mean now, and I've seen it this year in a couple RSRs already. And I don't know if we have a good answer to that, but one of the things that some other IOUs have done is they've added a column saying that particularly if the GRC was finished and then the compliance requirement came in later, there's a variance that's they defined as a variance is a function of the new regulation. And so they've had a column in there that when they describe the variance that says it's a regulatory requirement.
Right, and I believe that we've done similar things. It just means that it makes the linearity between an accountability report and a specific program not as one-to-one as
Yes.
An auditor might prefer. But we do things because they are operationally the most efficient way to do it, or because the system will only, how you manage it has to be reasonable, right? And so that's what we're attempting to move forward and saying that we can do all of those calculations. You would certainly not want to have, as my example, you would not want to have the original patrols be done and then send kind of like a new patrol activity out there and end up spending twice as much money when maybe you only needed to spend 10% more if you had, implemented it into kind of the original program. And so, we need to have a mechanism, or we need to have methods to make sure that we're not penalized for being efficient in our operational mindset, right?
Yes, I'm getting that now. Okay. That's a really good comment. And I don't have an answer for it, but we need to suss that one out. Okay. I don't see any other hands popping up. Anyone want to come through with any closing remarks at this point?
Jordan, this is Valerie with Southwest Gas. I'm sorry I didn't raise my hand. I do have a quick question, or maybe an ask. I know you mentioned that comments are due, workshop comments are due on December 15th. And you mentioned that maybe in lieu of a technical working group meeting, that if our comments were detailed enough that we may, forego that technical working group. But can you expand on, in terms of the type of detail you were looking for in comments, or if you can't maybe answer that right, now, if maybe, if you wouldn't mind, like, maybe sending an email to the group, and, then it would give us a basis to file comments on?
Right. So I'm hoping to gather some more comments on the issues required as defined by the proceeding and outlined in the presentation.
Okay.
But a couple other things came up today that were derivative of that. We should be able to respond to those. As far as the level of detail, it's going to be a function of how the comments come in, and if there are any that I believe are oppositional, and then that we need more details to address it. But I'm leaning more to having just one more round of technical discussions. I learned a lot just from today's presentations and even from the questions. I think it helps me suss it out and prepare the staff proposal, or prepare the issues that may go into a joint proposal. So I don't know, Valerie, if I could provide detail of what, how much of a comment we would need. but ultimately we would need a comment that would be able to support the voluntary agreement either as a supplemental or as a redo of it that would then roll into this decision ultimately. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
It makes sense in terms of like even just addressing the questions in the scope. So I thought maybe you were looking for something more specific, but if that's what you're looking for, that's understood. Thank you.
Okay, and again, I always like specific. It always makes my job easier. So don't be afraid of putting details. If there's a specific tweak or change you want to see that we can add to the proceeding, that would be great.
Okay. Thank you, Jordan.
And then we have somebody named Andy with a hand up. You should be able to ask your question, Andy. And introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Andy Brown with Ellison Schneider Harrison Donlan. We are counsel for various SMJUs. I just had a quick question. See if I can just had it. Missed it. On the three topics, how are you interpreting the notion of the standardization of the process? I mean, there's sort of distinctions between each of the SMJUs, and they're all very distinct from the bigs. Is the notion that you just would have a common framework, and to the extent things don't apply, people would just say, oh, that doesn't apply, or something different?
I think it comes in on many different levels, including like the report, everything from like report timing submittal all the way down to what should the column and header of every report look like, to everything in between. But I think because of the diversity of the SMJUs that we probably are looking at somewhere in between where we want to talk about the specific reporting requirements. And I'm focusing on that just because I think though the reporting requirements and the format of that facilitates review, makes it easier for the public to get involved when the reports are coming in a standard format, as well as timing. So again, I appreciate the comment that we can't make it too specific and too standard, otherwise it doesn't fit everybody. But
Yeah,
also,
and the goal of greater public participation, are you talking about customer groups that might be common across all three? Because I'm not even sure there's much of that, frankly.
yes, there is a couple interveners that do look at multiple SMJUs, but also just from CPU staff and also from consistency year to year, just to expedite and make these reports more accessible for everybody.
Okay, thanks.
And Chris, do you want to provide us with some other comments here before we wrap up?
Yes, thank you. Because so as I understand it, Jordan, part of this process will help determine, a comments or reporting requirements that might be a common format that would then be used in the next development of the SMJU process, if I understand it. And so part of my questions had to do with, for the RDF, for the larger utilities, they all now have, in the most recent decision, a set of safety metrics that are adopted. And so I don't know if Heidi is still available from Pacific Core, but I was going to just check with her if Pacific Core, well, two things. One is if Pacific Core sees any issue with developing or reporting the same set of metrics. It didn't sound like Bear Valley had any issue. They already report stuff in their WMPs. But also if Pacific Core, since Pacific Core operates under just different jurisdictions with different safety requirements, including the National Electrical Safety Code, if your experience is that there's stuff that you apply and processes that you apply to National Electrical Safety Code, which could benefit the commission or in terms of its objective of trying to get risk managed in the most efficient way possible, just because Pacific Corp operates in different jurisdictions. If there's anything that you have anything you could share on that, since you didn't have a presentation today. Those are 2 questions if there's time.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me, Chris?
Loud and clear.
Okay, super. So it is an interesting question with the multi-state relevance and the multi-code relevance. But in many ways, in order to be aligned with regulations, they are not necessarily as, you don't necessarily deliver the same standards or programs within each of them because they need to be managed relevant to both the compliance risks and also the operating differences, operating risks themselves. So there are some pieces that may actually be extensible across the system, and you could quantify that risk, whether you're in California or you're in Utah or Idaho or wherever, and under a different code jurisdiction. But there are others that are a little bit more challenging for that, which can create some of the complication in trying to actually rationalize, like what your performance history might be or whatever. So it's something that we could be, I guess, aligned toward trying to improve on, but I don't know that right now we have that risk extensibility as clearly articulated as it sounds like would be the expectation. And I will say that to the CPUC's credit, the whole kind of RAMP and SMAP process is, it's the first of our states to, push that direction. So in some ways, we kind of have to shoehorn the NESC piece into it to the extent it makes sense. There were 2 questions there, though, Chris, and I think the second was whether we would be willing to participate in something like that, and I think that we would be.
Great. Chris, did you want to respond?
Yeah. The other question was specific to the metrics. The commission has adopted a suite of metrics related to safety. For example, emergency response time for electric calls and that kind of stuff. There's a bunch of them. Not all would apply to Pacific Corp, but do you see any big problem with having those apply to the SMJUs?
I think we'd need to look at them more thoroughly, and we could commit to that for the next conversation or whatever, or include that as part of our comments. But some of them may be very easy to deal with. Some of them may be very challenging. And I will say, while Paul said that it's easy to go through and perform the quarterly data response that's required as part of the WMPs and OEIS's, the OEIS submittal, it's a lot of work, and for us now, maybe as we get better with it with time, it will be less work, but right now it consumes a fair amount of effort. So if we kind of pancake that with some more, that's more work that is that needs to be factored into people's activities and into staffing requirements.
Excellent. I appreciate those last thoughts. Those are important things to remember. And then Paul Marconi's had his hand up for a bit. Paul, did you want to add any closing comments here?
Yeah, On the, I guess the third topic, no comments were received that suggest RSR process should not apply to GRC applications resolved through settlement agreements. We probably, when we provide comments, we'll need to address that, because I'm not sure how much experience you had with settlement agreements, but typically they're made at a high level and with a broad brush. And
Right.
but the RSRs are very specific. And so, yeah, if you cut or agree on a top line number, how does that trickle down into the RSR? I mean, you could ratio it, but that might not be right, because something may have more of a safety impact than something else, and so you don't want to cut anything out of that one, and maybe reduce others more proportionally. So I think it's important that if a settlement is reached, which is always preferable, that settlement include how the RSR is going to be parsed out.
Absolutely. And even if it is settled at a high level, you still would have the opportunity, or the utility would ultimately have to suss out where those mitigations, or how the mitigations are going to be funded. So I would think the simple answer on that would be, if you do have a settlement agreement that only has a high level number, but you do have required mitigations, that then it's on the onus of the utility to figure out what they allocate, because it's not a GRC imputed cost anymore. It would have to be determined at the utility level how they want to budget that, and then it just becomes tracking the GRC cycle.
Right.
This is not explicit in any of the proceedings or agreements. It's just one way to deal with it, and I would think any future settlement agreement would have to address that.
Yep, agree.
Okay, perfect. All right, in respect of time, it's 3:03, and I said we were going to be done by 3 o'clock. I appreciate y'all making it here on Thanksgiving week. Oh, we have our co-host Kevin probably want to say a final remark before we
I
close this out?
I actually wanted to talk to Paul. Paul's situation with Bear Valley is a special one, because being a tiny company, it's really easy to have a settlement agreement. There aren't a lot of parties. So a settlement, it's called a black box settlement, right? A headline number is agreed upon. I like Paul's idea of, maybe stipulating inside of the general rate case decision how the RSAR will be quote unquote parsed. This issue is being dealt with in track 3 of the risk-based decision-making process proceeding. But the issue there is in how the RSAR is imputed. So with most utilities, the RSAR has to be imputed, because costs are calculated at a categorical level and not at the project level or the program level. So you might have a category of generation, or you might have a category of electric distribution. So the cost might be aggregated at that point. And so the company will use work units that are identified to impute the cost for each program, or they might do it the opposite way, where they impute the amount of money and develop a unit value too. So this isn't an uncommon problem. It's just not commonly at such a high level. And so Paul, I appreciate the idea that you had there, where a GRC might stipulate something. And I look forward to reading informal comments on this topic.
All right, if everyone would bear with us for just a couple more minutes. I still see that Chris just put his hand down. Heidi just put her hand. Oh, wait, are you still having your hand up? I can't tell. Chris, did you want to say anything else before we wrap it up?
No. Thank you.
I just saw your hand was still. Okay, well, in that case, I think we are done, and I really appreciate y'all attending during Thanksgiving week here. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving, and I really look forward to receiving some comments. Feel free to reach out directly if you want to talk about this before you submit it, or I will eagerly await to do some reading on December 15th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.